My name is Kate. Last year I attended a coding bootcamp called Founders and Coders from July to October, and I now work as a junior engineer at the Financial Times, an internal product. When I'm not coding, I enjoy photography, writing, cycling, everything to do with coffee, and I have two beautiful guinea pigs named Mopsa and Phoebe, although I generally only show photos of Mopsa because she's the photogenic one. Usually my talks are a vehicle to show off my guinea pigs, but there's more, I promise. Most of my talk today is going to focus on my time at Founders and Coders, or FAC as we call it. So Founders and Coders is a UK-based nonprofit that develops and runs tuition-free, peer-led training programs in web development, guided by our core values of cooperation, inclusion, and social impact. And in straightforward terms, that means that the course is free and we don't have paid teachers. In fact, each cohort is taught by the previous cohort, who become the mentors, overseen by a course facilitator. And our mentors are there to introduce concepts to us and guide us when we get stuck, but the curriculum is all available on GitHub, and we're largely responsible for teaching ourselves and others who are on the cohort with us through pair programming and group research. The curriculum has been built up and evolved over the years by each cohort, and at the end of our time at FAC, we take a look back at what we thought was taught well, what wasn't, what we think should be changed. Decisions about the course content, how the program is run, stuff like that are made cooperatively and by consensus from the current cohort and alumni. And I mention these things now because they're not just central to the FAC experience, but because they have a bearing on what I'm going to talk about later on. So this is my cohort, FAC 14, plus some of our mentors are course facilitator Lucy and Dan Sofer in the yellow there, who runs the whole program. And if we all look a bit bewildered and hot and bothered, that's because it was week 2 and we had just been introduced to test-driven development, and we were starting to realize what we'd gotten ourselves into. And also, if you remember, last summer was just like crazy hot all the time. I think it was like 35 degrees in that room for most of the course. So what does it mean to become a full stack developer at FAC? It's basically a full-time job where your job is learning, Monday to Friday, 10 to 6. Starting in week 1, we have our toolkit week, which brings together the CSS and HTML and JavaScript knowledge that we do in the course prep work. And it starts us working together on version control using Git. And you've never seen so many merge conflicts in one room over 1 week. It's a lot of hectic fun. And over the next few weeks, we learn everything we need to become full stack devs: test-driven development, callbacks, APIs, HTTP requests, building a server with Node, building, connecting to, and working with databases, authentication, Node Express, and finally templating with handlebars. And then after our reading week, we come back and do client projects and also React week. And each week during the first 8 weeks where we're learning is rounded off with a project built in 1.5 days, using the concepts that we learned that week and building on previous week's concepts as well. So yeah, all the things you need to be able to come out the other end and build web apps for clients in the second half of the course in 8 weeks. And if it sounds overwhelming, that's because it is. A pretty significant amount of time was dedicated to feeling like this. And at the end of most weeks, we kind of felt like we were holding on to these concepts by the skin of our teeth, callbacks week and React week especially. But somehow, when we came back from reading week and started our client projects in week 10, we were doing what they said we would, building apps using everything we'd learned, and they looked good, and they worked, and somehow we realized we'd learned to code, which kind of made us feel even more like, what? How? So I find it pretty cool that you can bring a disparate group of people together, kind of throw them into a pressure kettle, and essentially give them a new skill in 8 weeks and a new career path in 16. And to me, figuring out how this is possible is about looking at the environment in which this can happen and what factors have the biggest influence. And for me, the single biggest factor at Founders and Coders is a culture based on psychological safety. Psychological safety is a term coined by Amy Edmondson, a behavioral scientist at Harvard, and it's defined as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. This means being able to be yourself, speak up, make and admit to mistakes, share knowledge and ideas, without the fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. It's gotten a lot of attention in recent years as a contributing factor to organizations like Google that are high-performing, innovative, creative, fast-moving. The study that seems to crop up a lot around psychological safety is Google's Project Aristotle, which found that the best-performing teams at Google shared some common traits. They could depend on each other. They had clearly defined goals for the team and roles within the team. The team was doing meaningful work, and each person within the team felt that their work had an impact on the work that they were trying to achieve. But these things weren't enough. They also had to feel okay to challenge each other, ask questions, even the stupid ones. There are no stupid questions. And to sometimes fail and admit mistakes, meaning that they needed to feel psychologically safe with their team. And so all of that sounds great for teams at a job. So what does it necessarily have to do with an environment like FAC, where learning is the main goal? So the thing about learning, especially a skill such as coding, where you have to practice and build with the concepts you're learning, is that you're going to make a lot of mistakes and probably have more than a few complete failures and roadblocks, and you're going to be overflowing with questions all the time. When you have 16 weeks to acquire these skills that you need to get a job in coding, you don't have time to be immobilized by the fear of whether you can speak up and ask a question or not, or be afraid to present something that you think isn't perfect. It requires unlearning a lot of preconceptions we generally have about whether it's all right to fail publicly, whether it's okay or not to quite understand something the first time or not, whether it's okay to be the person in the group who sets that pace because you need a bit more time to grasp a concept. So you have to very deliberately set out to build an environment and culture where people understand that these things are okay and expected. So what are some things that we did at FAC to create that environment? Set expectations and get everyone involved. So one of Edmondson's papers on psychological safety says that one practical takeaway on psychological safety is that this positive interpersonal climate, which is conducive to learning and performance under uncertainty, does not emerge naturally, which basically means you have to build it yourself. You can't just bring people together and have psychological safety naturally happen. And because psychological safety focuses on group members' beliefs about a group's norms and what's acceptable within the group, this means that you have to set those norms. So when we join FAC, we sign a student agreement and a code of conduct, which sets the groundwork for how we deal with each other. And the short form is our community is dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone. It's important for safety in general for people to know that they can participate in a team or community and won't be excluded or harassed, and that's a huge foundation of being able to take a step towards psychological safety on top of that within the group. So a code of conduct and house rules are basics to have, but you can and should go even further. So in my first week as a mentor for FAC 15, the course facilitator, Michael, asked them to go a step further and come up with their own code of conduct beyond the one that FAC provides. And so he said, of course you'd expect a harassment-free experience at the very least, but what else would you expect from your cohort, and how you deal with each other? He asked them to set their own norms. And this is what they came up with. There's a lot of gems in here. I especially love the whole giving people time and space to answer questions rather than just offering it at the first sign of hesitation, and checking for mutual understanding before you move on from a concept that's being learned. What I found interesting was that a lot of this stuff were things that my cohort had come to verbalize at some point and agree to over the course of our 16 weeks together. Unfortunately, sometimes after things had gotten super stressy. And some of this is part of the ethos of FAC in general, but by sitting down on day one and explicitly codifying how they deal with each other and what they expected from each other, FAC 15 were already pretty far ahead of where we were as a cohort on day one. It showed me it's important not to just hand down a code of conduct, but to actively have members of a team, group, or community involved in creating that so that people feel like their voices are being represented and they know that fellow members are aware of these values and also share them. But that's not it. You can't just lay down the rules once and expect things to be fine forever. It requires maintenance, like code. Think of it as technical debt. It's a cultural debt. Group dynamics change, you learn new things and go through new experiences together. Communication is key. You have to evaluate new knowledge and experiences and decide if things need to change based on input. At FAC, we had retrospectives at the end of each week called SGCs, Stop, Go, Continues. Basically, we were encouraged to reflect on the week, how we felt about the material and how it was taught, what we did well, what we wanted to keep doing, what we thought should not continue. Topics range from, hey, let's stop forgetting to water the plants, to let's give more time to this workshop on callbacks because it turned my brain inside out, or more contentious stuff like certain conflicts that had arisen over the week and things people were uncomfortable with or unhappy about. But by constantly talking about it and everything that was happening, we made sure everyone was on the same page and things were brought out in the open that needed to be dealt with. And we all had our say in the continued building of our cohort's culture. And speaking of bringing up difficult things, this is probably the most misunderstood aspect of psychological safety. Having psychological safety in a group doesn't mean being super nice and shiny and happy all the time. In fact, that can be counterproductive. If you have to put on a good face and everyone always has to smile, then things can go unfixed that ought to be addressed. Conflict and criticism are naturally a part of building a psychologically safe environment, but just as much as psychological safety doesn't equal niceness, conflict and criticism does not equal being mean-spirited. It takes work and curation of the discussion from everyone involved to ensure that things don't end up that way. One of my favorite lines about criticism is from a podcast called Feminist Frequency, and it says to be critical of the media you love. And I think that captures the idea of proper criticism for me, that if you care about something, a community you're a part of, and you want to improve it, you should be able to offer constructive criticism that helps them improve. An ethos of leaving things better than you found it. So at our SGCs, often critique was aimed at how some of the material was taught, followed by productive discussions of how it could be improved for future cohorts. And if you're going to make it okay for people to offer criticism for improvements, you need to encourage candor, honesty, and people being honest about their experiences and feelings. Going back to the bit about reevaluating expectations, one of the more interesting things that happened during our cohort was that we were given a bit of advice, a guideline in week 1, to try and make sure that on each project we built, each member had roughly the same number of Git commits. So as we were all doing pair programming, try and keep the number of commits the same. Seems straightforward enough. Fast forward to about week 6 or 7, and something had happened with this piece of advice we've been given. There were a lot of people upset that some weeks, some team members would have far more commits than others. Some people were worried because they thought that employers looked at GitHub commits as evidence of how much you contributed to a project or not, and would make judgments based on that. Naturally, this made people who believed that really nervous about being seen to be falling behind. Other people simply saw commit numbers as a guideline for measuring that everyone was getting about the same amount of coding practice while pairing, and were more relaxed about it. Some people got some pretty strong words said to them for having an outsized number of Git commits, and generally there were misunderstandings all around. We left it far too long and didn't bring it up. But eventually it was brought up in Stop, Go, Continue. And it was probably the hardest discussion we had. I wish I could show the transcript, like all of our other Stop, Go, Continues, 1 page. This one was like 3 pages. The person could barely keep up. There were a lot of strong feelings on both sides, and there was a heck of a lot of candor. But after weeks of build-up, finally it was out in the open, and we were able to actually discuss it and moderate the discussion rather than bottling it up, and making assumptions about people's motivations or thought processes. And that was unfortunately an example of something we hadn't done so well for a while. And I'm not entirely sure we ever actually all agreed why the commits were important, but going forward, at least both sides had an understanding of each other and how each other felt, and there was less focus on the number of commits and more refocus on making sure everyone was doing the same amount of work, because that's how we learned, through practice and actual coding. And that refocus was what we needed, because it was part of what we needed to be focused on all along, the success of the group over the success of the individual. Mine seemed counterintuitive that learning at a breakneck pace would mean, at FAC, moving at the speed of the people who need the most help, but FAC does a lot to break down assumptions that these people are holding anyone back. We're told over and over from day one that some weeks will be the teachers that will understand the concepts, and when we do, we should happily help those around us and bring them up to our level. And some weeks will be the students, will have more trouble grasping the concepts, and will be the ones asking more questions and needing more guidance. And when we are, we shouldn't feel embarrassed to ask as much as we need. The great thing is, when you tell people that over and over and people begin to speak up about questions they have and others answer without judgment, it does begin to breed an atmosphere of confidence that you can be open about your struggles and what you need to keep up with everyone else. Often we'd have someone stand up from a group and say to the whole room, "Hey, I'm having trouble with this. Anyone else?" And usually, yeah, someone else was, and they'd help each other out. At the end of each week, we give presentations talking about what we learned. And that wasn't just the good stuff, it was about stuff we got stuck on and other tidbits of knowledge that we found cool that other groups might not have learned. And the end result is that we'd all make it to the end of the week knowing pretty much the same information, and often a lot more than if we tried to focus on learning this stuff individually. So instead of this, a mad rush to make the coolest project and get kudos for showing off all your unique knowledge, it was a lot more like this, where we shared our highest highs and helpful tidbits of info, but also our big mistakes, so that others could learn from them and avoid them in the future. Speaking of learning from mistakes and failing, which I've mentioned a lot, you have to normalize it, and that takes work and repetition and is really, really hard, because we live in a society where failure is often mocked and seen as shameful and dissected to find all the wrongdoings that led to it. It's a pretty bad attitude, I think, because you can learn a lot from making mistakes and failing. I'm not sure how you guys learned to code, but I bet it involved a lot of trial and error, maybe, hopefully in private if you were lucky. But we didn't really have that luxury at FAC. We were thrown together for 16 weeks, and we're learning in front of each other constantly, so it's hard to hide mistakes and failure. You have to get comfortable with it, and we had to remind each other week after week that it's okay, we're going to learn from it. And actually, my group's final project was a complete and absolute failure. We had one page working. It was a 404 page, and this was it. We were learning Express and handlebars, and so many things went wrong. Our presentation that week was a parade of all the mistakes we made. The scope of our project was way too big. We had not researched the API that we decided to use. There was some machine learning thrown in there. Like, no. After 8 weeks of learning to code, no. We tried out lots of new NPM packages that we hadn't dealt with before, because why not? It was just really, really bad. But I bet no one in our cohort is going to make any of those same mistakes after we told them about ours. It could have been a really uncomfortable presentation elsewhere, showing our 404-page app, but we knew we were in a safe, constructive environment, and we had a lot of fun really deconstructing how our project went so wrong at every single stage, and there were plenty of GIFs and laughs all around, particularly this GIF. And I got probably the best code comment that I'll ever receive. It was so spicy. I love this 404 page that I'm meeting on every link I go to. So why does our culture at FAC and psychological safety in general matter so much? I think it's because when we deliberately build these kind of environments, we're creating places where we and others can be our best selves, because we can ask all the questions, try all the things, troubleshoot our mistakes, learn from our collective failures, all without the guilt and the fear I think a lot of us have picked up at some point or another. With all that baggage, imagine how much faster we could learn from each other and progress. When we set out to build projects we work on in our jobs and on the side, we often spend time planning the architecture and choosing the stack, and as we build, we refactor and improve it and constantly strive to make it better. So I think we should be just as deliberate in caring about the teams and communities that we build and take part in, and to create the kind of environments where we feel safe and can flourish. So one last dog gif, and I hope these are some of your takeaways today, that you should be deliberate about the culture you build, don't leave it to chance. It requires active maintenance and participation from the whole group, and it won't always be sunshine and rainbows, but in the end it'll be worth it. So I hope you'll try and bring some of these ideas into your teams at work and the communities you're part of, like the React community, and more. And we were able to achieve quite a lot at FAC because we flourished in our environment, and I'd love to see more spaces where others can do that too.